a professor at Loyola Law School, as you probably know, and I've done a fair amount of work over the last 20 years almost now, litigating, writing a little bit about, and testifying in various places, including the House Judiciary Committee, about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. And so what I want to talk about today is reparations in general, really, but focused on the Tulsa Race Massacre and some of the lessons that we can learn from that incident and the various responses to it. So the first thing to note is that the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 was an unparalleled event in United States history, yet it went virtually unknown, unremarked, and untaught for 75 years after the massacre. This work of erasing racial violence and Black political movements from the national consciousness is once again, unfortunately, a feature of our politics, in part as a response to the success of Black political movements nationwide. So today I will discuss the importance of the lessons from the massacre and what it can teach contemporary reparations movements at the city, state, and national level. So it's worth mentioning that HR 40 is a bill that's been around for well over 2 decades now, seeking reparations, or at least a study, a preliminary study to determine what reparations might be due to the descendants of enslaved African Americans, and the state of California currently has a reparations task force. LMU professor Cheryl Grills is one of the members of that task force. It's supposed to report in 2023 to determine what reparations might be due to Black Californians, and particularly descendants of enslaved people. And the city of Los Angeles has its own reparations task force. So California, you might think, is a major place in which reparations is a hot topic and is taking the lead in reparations nationally. But the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma dipped its toe in doing a reparations study in 2001, and we engaged in some litigation following that. And so it's worth thinking about the race massacre and some of the problems that came out of the failure to engage in thoroughgoing reparations in 2001 with that report. So let's start with the massacre. So I can show you a few pictures of the massacre. And so the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, you might think of as perhaps the largest domestic terrorist attack in United States history. On May 30th, 1921, some African Americans mobilized to stop a lynching in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In response, white citizens deputized by the city police and the county sheriff and aided by the state National Guard burned down the 36 to 40 city blocks of Greenwood, a thriving African-American residential and business district in Tulsa. More than 9,000 Black people were left homeless, and almost 1,500 homes and businesses were destroyed. At least 300 people were estimated to have been murdered, although their actual number may be much larger. Overnight, 5,000 African Americans became homeless. 3,000 terrorized people fled the city. The rest were rounded up and forcibly detained in internment camps at the Tulsa ballpark and its convention center. Black Tulsans were held under guard and were paroled only for work purposes. And the Red Cross had to mobilize to provide tents through the winter for the thousands who remained. So you can see some of the pictures here of the destruction of the massacre. These are contemporary photographs, some of them used as postcards to send out to people showing the massacre. So it's an amazing amount of destruction, and so far there has been no truly thorough investigation into the massacre, even despite the commission formed in 2001. So in the wake of the massacre, the city and state of the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma moved quickly to suppress news of the massacre. Survivors were terrorized into silence. All mention of it was excised from official accounts of Oklahoma history, and the details of the massacre only became public in 2003 after the state of Oklahoma formed a commission, including historians, lawyers, and activists, to report on the massacre. The commission's painstaking research through the historical record discovered much previously unavailable material. The commission apportioned financial damages and proposed that reparations be paid to the survivors and the descendants, but the state refused to make good on these recommendations. And as a result, I was part of a legal team, including Professor Charles Ogletree, who led it, and Loyola Law School alumnus Johnny Cochran. And we filed together a federal lawsuit trying to complete the process begun by the commission. The only obstacle to our success, the courts acknowledged, was the statute of limitations, a rule requiring the survivors to file any lawsuit within 2 years of the massacre. These statutes of limitations are the major impediment to many reparations lawsuits, but we're now back in court seeking reparations under a different theory of public nuisance, and I'll talk about that lawsuit in a few minutes' time. The Tulsa experience demonstrates that the harms of slavery and segregation scar our communities to this day. The state of Oklahoma, the city of Tulsa, the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce, and the white citizens of Tulsa dismantled economically, politically, and culturally a specific community, African Americans in Tulsa. Subsequent generations of Greenwood residents have labored under social and political disempowerment while trying to build their community. And whilst a monetary payment would count as a beginning, economic justice is not enough without racial justice to repair the specific race-based wrongs of the Tulsa massacre and its aftermath. To quote Harvard law professor and reparations activist, Professor Charles Ogletree, quote, "Reparations are more than an exercise in education, remembrance, and apology. Reparations demand the political, social, and economic power and equality for African Americans that has been stifled and suppressed in America since its inception," end quote. You can see some of the impact of the massacre on the Black people who remained in Tulsa or who moved there subsequently through the words of historian John Hope Franklin, whose father was a lawyer in Greenwood during the massacre and who moved to Greenwood at about the age of 10. He wrote that, quote, "Prior to the massacre, the Black community in Tulsa had been economically prosperous, not to mention spiritually and physically cohesive and strong. The combination of circumstances that existed after the massacre made it impossible for Blacks in Tulsa to live as upstanding and fearless, even if they initially tried to do so. People did not just lose their homes and businesses, they seemed eventually to lose part of their dreams and their will. Eventually, given the economic devastation and the persistent and complete separation and indifference of the white community, a pall of discouragement set in among the Black community. And because the city has never honestly confronted what happened, that pall persists to this day," end quote. The victims of the massacre include our current clients, Ms. Bessie Randall, known affectionately as Mother Randall, who's 107 years old, and Ms. Viola Fletcher, who's also 107, and her younger brother, Mr. Hughes Van Ellis, who just turned 101 a couple of weeks ago. It used to include the 125 then living survivors I represented in 2003, But the city of Tulsa essentially waited for them to die off one by one without ever compensating them. And they're doing the same with Mother Randall, Miss Fletcher, and Mr. Van Ellis. But our community of people that we're representing in different ways in the litigation has included some of the current descendants and the diaspora of the race massacre. And I'll come back to this in a moment, but one thing I do think it's worth really recognizing is just how much of the Black community in the United States are diasporas and exiles from places in which anti-Black violence happened. Almost every Black person in America whose family goes back more than a generation or two has a tale of anti-Black violence in their history. So, so the Tulsa race massacre not only was contained within the city of Tulsa, but reverberated outside of Tulsa, affecting Black people across the country. Economist Lisa Cook recently demonstrated that the massacre significantly impacted Black entrepreneurship, not only in Tulsa, but across the United States. When the state and federal governments did nothing in the face of such violence, Black people lost confidence in the government's willingness to protect their rights. The failure to prosecute the white perpetrators of anti-Black violence continued a spate of anti-Black racial violence across the southern and Midwestern United States. The violence had started during the Redemption era, with one of the largest massacres occurring in Colfax County, Louisiana in 1872, in which a group of 170 or so ex-Confederate soldiers led by Christopher Columbus Nash sought to overturn the election in Colfax County by attacking the courthouse where the ballot boxes were, which was defended by over 100 Black people, many former Union soldiers. After holding out for weeks, they were burned out of the building and massacred in one night for having the temerity to vote. The resulting Supreme Court case, Cruikshank versus United States, shut the door on the era of Reconstruction and created the state action doctrine, preventing the federal government from trying the defendants who had engaged in the acts of racial violence. There was about only 9 people indicted by the grand jury, and only 3 in the case before the Supreme, by the time the case got to the Supreme Court. The thing to recognize about the Tulsa race massacre is that it followed massacres in, among other places, East St. Louis and Chicago, Illinois, and Helena, Arkansas, Oswego, Florida, Omaha, Nebraska, and after Tulsa, Rosewood, Florida. So we can think of the 1910s and the 1920s as forming essentially a second era of redemption in the United States. So what's remarkable about United States history is the amount of consistency of deadly anti-Black violence targeting communities for disruption and resulting in vast movements of people fleeing white terrorism. Massive Black diasporas emerged, of course, in the wake of the Civil War, as Black people were left without land or shelter. And this second redemption in the 1910s and 1920s resulted in another massive refugee movement of Black people from the South, euphemistically titled the Great Migration. Instead of detention camps, as in Tulsa, these refugees and exiles from anti-Black violence were held in detention communities, the segregated and redlined urban ghettos of the North. Yet our stories of the Great Migration rarely focus on the spate of race massacres that I've just detailed, often of newly returned soldiers from the First World War or of local landowners. And these stories fail to account for the massive dislocation and destitution, the sheer loss of land, property, community, and political power that this reign of anti-Black terror accomplished. What is remarkable about the Colfax case, unlike the subsequent acts of white supremacist terror, is that we know the identity of at least some of the murderers, Nash and Cruikshank. That is in large part thanks to the federal prosecution of the crime. After the Cruikshank case left it up to the states to engage in prosecution, the names of the murderers are largely unknown, and their acts of terror go ignored and unpunished as if they had not existed. This forced forgetting, this ability to rewrite history, to suppress the largest, most bloody single attack on Black people in the United States in the case of Tulsa, is an amazing act of power. Who tells the story of the Tulsa race massacre and these other massacres continues to shape the contemporary response to demand for justice for the survivors and descendants in the United States. That unaccountability has real contemporary consequences. Missing from the new recounting of the Tulsa race massacre are the stories of the white Tulsans who participated as part of the mob. By reducing these real people, these fathers and grandfathers of present-day Tulsans to some faceless mass, they have become invisible. Without a grand jury to investigate the white rioters, to record their names, all we have left is some evanescent, nameless mob. These people decided not to investigate their part in the massacre. Without a grand jury to function like a truth commission, the story of the massacre could be erased. Following the massacre, the city and its white citizens were able to decide to move on, while Black people in Tulsa and around the United States lived in real fear of white supremacist terroristic threats. These grandfathers and fathers of present-day white Tulsans decided that they were not going to compensate the victims, and so they placed a real debt on future generations as that bill comes due. As John Hope Franklin noted in the passage I quoted earlier, the Black citizens of Tulsa suffered not only during the massacre, but also after, due to the continuing acts of the white community to segregate the Black folks, to deny them the same access to sanitation and to hospitals, to locate environmental hazards in their community, to engage in deadly police violence, and ultimately to fragment the community by driving a freeway through it. In these acts, Tulsa is not unique, but emblematic. In our most recent case, we've argued that the massacre and the subsequent acts targeting the Greenwood and North Tulsa communities are a public nuisance, that they inflict damage to property that undermines the health, safety, and security of the community. Although inspired by the novel use of public nuisance law in the various municipal and state opioid cases around the country, our use of the public nuisance statute is really a much more traditional one. Rather than seeking an extensive statewide remedy covering millions of people, we focus on two communities whose property was blighted not once during the massacre, but many times over subsequently. So what are the remedies we seek? Well, in our 2003 federal litigation under the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution and 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, we sought direct monetary payments from the state, county, and municipal governments for the injuries they caused identifiable people. The second sort of remedies, though, stem from the ongoing injuries inflicted by government actors in Oklahoma under public nuisance. So in our current litigation, the basic idea is that the state's actions harm the property and health of a whole community or neighborhood, and it's effectively the community or neighborhood that demand that these injuries be cleared up. We can show that from the time of the massacre onward, the city and county's racially discriminatory programs of urban development have inflicted specific harms on the Black community in neighborhoods of Greenwood and North Tulsa. For example, the city has refused to provide adequate sanitation. It's located medical services in the white neighborhoods and ignored the Black neighborhoods. It's destroyed buildings by locating a freeway in the Black neighborhood, and on and on. These are all specific wrongs imposed by the city, impacting the neighborhood and community as a whole. The sort of clearing up we've asked for under the public nuisance theory of community-wide harm includes property development, development of mental health and educational programs, creation of a land trust, construction of a hospital and urgent care center in the Black neighborhoods, immunity from all City of Tulsa and County of Tulsa taxes, scholarships, and preference for government contracting. As one of our clients, Hughes Van Ellis, said on National Public Radio a few weeks ago, so we filed the litigation in September 2020. We had a hearing on the City, County, Chamber of Commerce, and various other organizations' motions to dismiss in September 2021. We haven't heard back from the court yet. So Mr. Van Ellis said, as quote, "As I celebrate my 101st birthday, I'm still waiting on justice. At the age of 101, when will justice be done? The judge needs to move our case forward. My birthday cake is sweet, but justice would be sweeter," end quote. In addition, I've been a core part of the team drafting a letter to the United States Department of Justice, asking them to open an investigation under the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act of 2007. That act states as its principal purpose that it was enacted to provide for the investigation of certain unsolved civil rights crimes and for other purposes. We noted in a letter to the Department of Justice that prosecution is a secondary purpose, one of the other purposes contemplated by the Act. The Act primarily empowers the Deputy Chief in the Criminal Justice Section of the Civil Rights Division both to coordinate the investigation and prosecution of violations of criminal civil rights statutes that occurred not later than December 1st, 1969 and resulted in death. By the terms of the Act, then, the Deputy Chief may choose to investigate without contemplating subsequent prosecution. Yale law professor Monica Bell recently argued that failure to identify individuals erases white agency from the massacre and prevents what she calls democratic repair. The erasure of individual white agency from our understanding of the massacre continues to perpetuate the terror to this day. To illustrate the importance of an investigation, Viola Fletcher, one of the still living survivors, emphasized the importance of identifying the individuals who burned her family home and killed her neighbors in her testimony before Congress in 2021. "I still see Black men being shot," she said. Quote, "Black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see Black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I've lived through the massacre every day. I am 107 years old and have never seen justice. I pray that one day I will. I've been blessed with a long life and have seen the best and worst of this country. I think about the terror inflicted upon Black people in this country every day," end quote. There are plenty of lessons for our national, state, and local reparations task forces coming out of the Tulsa race massacre. One is that identifying not only the major wrongs, but all the myriad ways in which Black people in the United States have been harmed by their governments and organizations is necessary before we can assess the sorts of remedies needed to repair and transform our communities. The scope and scale of these wrongs help us fully comprehend the scope and scale of racial injustice. Reparations demands transformational justice that not only makes some payment, but that rebuilds and empowers Black communities to support and determine for themselves how that money can be spent. So I'm happy if folks have questions or comments. One of the things that we're doing at Loyola Law School and at the Loyola Anti-Racism Center, along with Kathleen Kim and Priscilla Chen and Sean Kennedy as well, is to think about what contemporary reparations might look like, especially given its incorporation in the Black Lives Matter platform. And one thing that students who are interested in reparations can do is help us research California statutes for the California Reparations Task Force, whose first report is going to come out at the end of this semester. And so we're looking for somewhere in the region of 3 to 5 research assistants to help with that work. And there should be a notice going out in the next day or so asking for folks who want to work on that. So you can email me or my assistant, Sonia Mua. If you are interested in that, send me your resume, and you can be part of reparations work yourself. So with that, any questions or comments? Sophia.
Yeah, first off, thanks for taking the time to speak about this super important issue. I know you were talking about one of the ways that the massacre has kind of been erased is through development. And specifically in Greenwood, there's been a lot of construction of like monuments to white heroes in a way, like the Woody Guthrie Museum and the Bob Dylan Museum, which is like going to be opened in Greenwood soon. And I was just curious if there's been efforts to incorporate community benefit agreements into like the construction of those buildings, or maybe like the One Oak, the baseball stadium, the BMX Hall of Fame, that are all like right in this historically Black area.
Great question. Are you from Tulsa?
My brother lives there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've witnessed the massive development of Greenwood that's taking place at the moment. And for me, when I went down there in 2021, I hadn't been for a while, seeing a ballpark located in the middle of Greenwood, given the history that I've just talked about of African Americans being interned in the ballpark, struck me as almost sacrilegious. So the short answer to your question is no. And one way of understanding what's going on, and we've discussed this as part of our litigation, so we have an unjust enrichment claim as well in the lawsuit, is that the history of the massacre is supposed to be commemorated in a building called Greenwood Rising, but none of the money from Greenwood Rising is going to the community. In fact, the director of Greenwood Rising has said that the building itself is reparations enough, and despite raising $30 million, so that's $30 million from various sources, of which 21 million went to building the Greenwood Rising project, the folks in Greenwood Rising have said expressly that none of that money is to go to the community. So the building is supposed to be the reparations, not any monetary payment. One of the grossest things about that building is that it is precisely the sort of public relations exercise that happened in 1921 after the massacre. So what happened after the massacre was that the local chamber of commerce actually started turning away money that was donated around the country because they wanted to minimize the impact of the massacre, because they were worried about the public relations hit that they would take. Now, in the wake of the attention that has come since 2001, and I'd say actually since the 2003 lawsuit, because Professor Ogletree engaged not only in litigation, but a massive push to get legislation passed and a big public relations exercise. And so I think you can say the Black community became aware of Black Wall Street and Tulsa's standing as one of the most economically vibrant places in the country prior to 1921. And then thanks to perhaps HBO's The Watchmen or Lovecraft Country, which both focused on the massacre, it's got a new bump in the white national consciousness. But what we're seeing is a sort of public relations push that doesn't really talk about white responsibility for the massacre, but instead focuses on feel-good stories. And so what we're getting is a sort of white massacre tourism that that seeks to redirect money back into white pockets and not into the Black community that's getting nothing from this. The last thing I'll say is that in 2021, there was a move to commemorate the centennial of the massacre. And the same group that promoted Greenwood Rising was promoting a centennial commission that sought to use the names of our clients, Ms. Fletcher, Ms. Randall, Mr. Van Ellis, without their permission, to put on a sort of massacre fest. And the community, led by sort of local and really national activist, Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, really mobilized and managed to put together an alternative commemoration that was supported by the still living survivors and the descendants, and included among massacre descendants, Alfred Woodard as one of the speakers among a whole host of prominent people and celebrities. So, you know, when I talk about a continuing erasure of the history, it's worth recognizing that these acts of memorialization are often also acts of erasure, and who gets to tell the story gets to determine who benefits from the history. We're seeing that around the country with critical race theory statutes, and Tulsa's, I think, really in the center of that. So there's a question in the chat from Professor Kaplan: how did it happen that Tulsa pre-1921 was home to such a prominent and prosperous Black community? So the short answer to that is that prior to 1907, Tulsa was known as Indian Territory. And for many African Americans, it was one of the places that they could go and live without Jim Crow laws segregating them. So in pre-1907 Oklahoma, and really going up through 1921, Oklahoma had the largest number of Black-run municipalities in the country. So it was a major site of Black governmental self-determination and experimentation. And on top of that was, of course, an oil boom. And so there was plenty of money going around Oklahoma in 1921. If you go to downtown Tulsa, you can see that it essentially stopped developing in the 1920s. All the buildings are essentially sort of Art Deco, massive Art Deco monuments, with a few 1930s government, federal government Depression era buildings thrown in, and then nothing until some of the sort of major foundations like the Kaisers, who are based there, start putting some money into municipal buildings in the 2000s, and then this massive expansion just recently in the ballpark in the Greenwood area. So historically, up through the 1920s, Tulsa was part of an oil boom, and it was a place that historically African Americans had sought refuge in. So Ralph Ellison, author of Invisible Man, himself a native Oklahoman, referred to it as the promised land for Black Americans. And Greenwood was known as the Black Wall Street and had at least 2 movie theaters, some of them actually very prominent movie theaters, a number of hotels, had its own hospital, and in the wake of the massacre, many of the leaders of Greenwood fled elsewhere to become leaders in their local communities. And so prominent doctors, lawyers, hoteliers around the nation. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Linda.
Thank you for doing this. This is just so incredibly interesting and really appreciate you agreeing to this. You mentioned the letters to DOJ. When did that go out and when do you expect to hear back something?
We are still speaking with DOJ, so we're going to speak to them again soon. The letter went out probably a couple of months ago. So we've spoken to DOJ. We then followed up with a letter. We then supplemented the letter with an affidavit from University of Colorado Law School Dean Innes, who it turns out is the descendant of the funeral directors in Tulsa during the massacre, whose family have passed down amazing and just really disturbing stories of retrieving bodies dumped in the Arkansas River. And so we've passed on her testimony to the City Graves Commission. The Graves Commission was working assiduously to try and discover mass graves until they discovered mass graves, at which point the city shut down the Graves Commission. The city talks a lot about wanting to address its past, but every time something comes up that seems potentially embarrassing, they suddenly shut it down. So we're constantly working against that and trying to come up with sort of grassroots-driven, often somewhat novel legal theories to try and hold the city accountable.
Okay. Thank you.
Professor Williams?
Yes, couple of questions. One, I had heard about the Graves Project. What excuse did they give for shutting that down? And then second, thinking about what you were discussing, which of course is incredibly important, how do you deal with the arguments about, A, procedural arguments legally, too much time has passed, B, reparations
that the remains had been exposed for a certain amount of time, and that the city felt they needed a dignified reburial, ignoring the fact that many of the descendants and the Graves Commission itself had plans for a dignified reburial, and the city's dignified reburial was to get a front loader to just shovel the dirt back on the graves. So, there are a lot of local people, historian Ralph Ellsworth, State Senator Goodwin, who testified in to Congress, are on the Graves Commission. They were deeply upset and appalled by the actions of the city there. And so part of what we're asking the DOJ to do is to support the Graves Commission in their efforts in finding out who was killed. The classic response from the city is the response that you're talking about, which is, no one's alive from 1921. That's not quite true. We've got 3 survivors that are alive from 1921, but most of the residents, the city of Tulsa, are taxpayers who weren't around at the time, which is in part why we're suing the municipality, which was around at the time. And we're suing the county, which was around at the time. So these organizations were around at the time, but more importantly, it's not as if Black Tulsans haven't paid their taxes and their money is going to a city that has terrorized and segregated and stigmatized them. But I think the sort of, in some ways, more powerful point that the public nuisance argument is making is the terror didn't stop in 1921, that the system of sort of white supremacy and anti-Black racism has been going on since then, has been used by the city, the Chamber of Commerce, the county, ever since then, to make decisions about where to locate amenities, who gets access to employment and education, how the police treat individuals in different parts of the city. And so our public nuisance lawsuit starts with the massacre, but it identifies distinct, discrete, continuing wrongs that have happened ever since then that target the property and persons and health of the Black community in North Tulsa. And I think there's a real lesson for reparations in that, because while slavery may be the original sin of the American project, the ways in which it has morphed and metastasized through Jim Crow and into mass incarceration, I think provide important lessons where we can track a massive amount of individual wrongs that have happened and that need to be accounted for at this national, state, and local levels. And that's why I'm excited that LMU, Marnie Campbell, a historian over at Maine campus, has been retained by the Reparations Task Force to do some work tracking the legal regime of discrimination in California at the federal, state, and municipal levels, and has reached out to the law school to see if we can help her with that project. So part of the project of reparations just is refusing to forget and refusing to let the perpetrators of violence memorialize away the sort of race-based wrongs that they have done over the past. In California, I suppose it's 170 years or so since we became a state, 1849. So that's something that we can do at Loyola. We can be part of that, and I think that's a really fantastic opportunity for us and for our students. Carrie?
Hi, I'm Carrie Jackson Lewis. That's all right. I'll answer to it. I'm a new director of development gift planning at Loyola, and estate planning attorney and philanthropic consultant. And I probably am not, having been many years from my JD, I'm probably not the one to do research, but how can we here at Loyola support your work and support your efforts? Is it through calling more attention to the work that's being done? Certainly, as I know that the law school is still looking for a development officer, so I can't tap them. But please, I would be grateful to find out how we can support your work across the university.
Well, that's fantastic. I just saw an article I can send you if you're interested, talking about how philanthropic organizations have become interested in funding reparations, and certainly we can always do with more money. I have to be a little bit coy in some of the stuff that we're planning, but just to give you a sense of what is happening at the law school, and a lot of it's relatively new thanks to the Lark Center. So we're working with LMU on just today, I've been discussing with Marnie Campbell at LMU a project for bringing on, as I mentioned, students to help work with the task force. We're discussing with the survivors of the California carceral sterilization or involuntary sterilization of women, how we can get involved with helping women obtain reparations that have been awarded under AB 2007 last year. And I'm planning on bringing onto the campus the attorneys and the major plaintiff in the litigation that got that award, Kelly Dillon. So we're in the process of discussing that. I think those are the two major public things, along with working on the Tulsa litigation. We'll also be hopefully setting up a project to research reparation statutes around the country, so both enacted and planned, so that we can essentially become a legislative repository to see the different ways that people are planning to think about reparations. And then the other part of the project is to think hard, along with Professor Priscilla Ochen's Developing Democracy project, about what reparations for police violence looks like, in particular to give flesh to the pronouncements by various civil rights organizations, including Black Lives Matter, that they're seeking reparations. I'm a big fan of that, but there isn't much detail in their reparations platforms. And so what we plan to do is connect with local members of the Los Angeles community to think about what reparations for policing in Los Angeles would actually look like, and come up with a sort of thicker and more developed understanding of that. So that's what's on the table at the moment.
Thank you. I know Priscilla Ochen is going on sabbatical soon. So who is taking up for her in her absence, or?
I mean, she's still going to be, I think, associated with the Loyola Anti-Racism Center in some capacity. And so it's through there. So Kathleen Kim and I will be doing that.
Holding up the fort. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. I think we're almost at time. Do we have time for one last question or comment, or is everyone heading off to class? Sounds like everyone's heading off to class. Why don't we finish there? I want to thank you for attending, and I'm around, so if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, want to get involved, come speak to me. I am happy to discuss it.
Thank you, Professor Miller.
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 And keep an eye out, because we're going to have 2 or 3 speakers come to either on campus or over Zoom, including the head of the Reparations Task Force, Ms. Camila Moore, who's an attorney, head of the California Reparations Task Force. And as I mentioned, we're hoping to get Kelly Dillon on campus as well.